Well, welcome you all. Nice to see some of you back, and especially great to welcome some newbies here. Those of you who are returnees will be bored for at least the first half hour because I've got to go through the usual binocular use and some other stuff. But we will cover that and move on and talk about bird migration. This is a kind of a potpourri of some of the species we may turn up this spring. And they include both songbirds and shorebirds. I think everybody knows the one in the upper left. You may know the one in the middle, too. A study in orange and black. That is a Baltimore Oriole. That picture was not taken here. It was taken by Crane Creek in Ohio, where the birds amass before they cross the Great Lakes in the springtime. And Baltimore Oriole is not a very strong fruit feeder in this area. We have some folks who have been putting out Oriole feeders, and they have nectar in them. And I've heard of one success so far. I have not heard of others. But if you get one, that's fantastic. We are going to go after Orioles about the middle of the term. That blue grosbeak actually was taken during this course, I think maybe in its first year at Bombay Hook. The birds had come up Delaware Bay and kind of exhausted and were sitting practically at our feet. The catbird is on territory and displaying. He's up not too far from where we're going to be going on Monday at the Foreman's Branch Banding Observatory. That's a fairly famous now in the middle of a prairie warbler, also taken during this course a couple of springs ago now, I guess it was, when this bird just wouldn't quit and was singing right at the head of the Nassawango Bear Swamp. And man, it would be great if he'll be back there again, even if we don't see him sitting like that. That's a yellow-breasted chat in the middle of the right middle. That was taken at Atkins Arboretum. Down below, I wonder what kind of bird that is.
Yeah, yellow leg?
No! How could you figure that out? We actually saw some yellow legs last semester, but they were all up, the birds were wading around up to their skivvies and we couldn't see the legs. But this is a classic greater, and it's a greater yellow legs, and those of you from the previous session will remember it has a slightly upturned bill. So that's a fairly classic look. That bird there is not a killdeer, but a lot of folks would think it is. It's a good deal smaller. It only has only one breast band instead of two, and that's the semi-palmated plover. We should see a lot of those when we go to Bombay Hook. And then again, in the previous session, we saw a few of these at Ocean City, but they were all mousy gray. There was no color to them at all. But its old name was red-backed sandpiper. I wonder why. And they have that black patch on the belly and the breeding plumage. This was actually taken at Pickering Creek when they first put in the wetlands there. And this isn't done. So with a little luck, we'll see all, but at least all, probably all. I hope. Probably here, most of them as well. Okay, so this is our splash, Birds and Birding from the Eastern Shore, Part 2. And it's brought to you by the Chesapeake Forum with collaboration from the Center of Environmental Society. Just met the new director up there last night, and it's on its way. All right, this is the schedule. If you got my email, I'm sorry, I'm usually a couple of days ahead of things. I've just been up to here. But there is a minor change in the schedule, and it's a little bit different than what maybe was put in the original course description for the Chesapeake Forum. But let's run through these fairly quickly. We have two classes, this being one of them, the other one on the 8th of June. In which we'll recap some of the birds we saw and look a little bit more at shorebird migration in particular, because that's going to be the subject of our 7th field trip when we go to Bombay Hook. On Monday, we're going to go up to the Foreman's Branch Bird Banding Observatory near Washington College, actually in Kingstown, this side of the Chester River, and have some demonstrations of the banding techniques they use, and hopefully get to hold a bird in the hand and release them. Last year we had a green heron, I think, at one of the times I was up there, and also a ruby-throated hummingbird hit the extremes. And we'll see, because migration is just getting underway, although I think a lot of the birds nowadays are beginning to wonder if they aren't late, given this heat. Anyway, we'll be going up there. I will send, normally well in advance, directions and arrangements in terms of whether we have to carpool or how we do that. We're going to try some, they may be fried by now, but lingering winter residence up at Frederick Douglass Park in the north east part of Talbot County, our newest public park, which is being managed as a grassland park with some nice scrub next door. Hopefully we'll see some of the remaining sparrows that are around and perhaps catch a witchetty, a Maryland yellowthroat, and a few other species like that. So that's also on a Monday. I've got everything on Mondays now. We're going to then go down to Bear Swamp and try to see if we can find that prairie warbler, but also a lot of other early warblers that are coming through a little bit ahead of the major leaf vest. So this is one chance that we may have the day to see the bird without having to peer through a lot of foliage. We'll also, if time allows, that's a day trip, so if time allows, we'll have lunch somewhere convenient and then try to do the upper end of Elliott's Island Road to see if the rails and the stilts and a couple of other birds are there, kind of on the way home. Then we're going to go to Atkins Arboretum. I call it more than warblers because by then some of our colorful finches like the blue grosbeak, indigo bunting, and perhaps scarlet tanager and summer tanager. Some of these really fine spring migrants should have arrived. Hopefully we'll get them to come in for us to see. On the 15th of May, we're going to go to Hope House in Tunis Mills, Peter Stifel's property. He's got nesting Baltimore Orioles there, and there's normally also orchard Orioles. So among others, we'll try to find both of those, and who knows what else. Then we're going to go, this is a popular trip, we're going to go up to Y Farm, which is being planted, has been planted in native flowering plants and grasses. And John Shaw will show us around that. We won't see as many flowers, but we're going to see plants that are really coming up. Last fall is absolutely gorgeous. And this may be one of the peak years come fall time. Try to get the Hobby Club up there. But in any case, the good news is that all of the seeds that he planted last year are now coming up, and including the second generation flowering things. He says it's loaded with black-eyed Susans. So it's a lovely, lovely place and an important kind of teaching point for early successional habitat that I'll explain more. Then finally, we'll go over to the edge of Delaware Bay and do shorebirds. The shorebird migration tends to be a couple of weeks after songbird migration. So it peaks in the middle of May. Birds aren't in that kind of a hurry because they've got to get up to the tundra, and the tundra may still be snow-covered in places. So they come a little bit later, but when they come in numbers and all in breeding plumage. The shorebirds can be tough. And so we'll look for the sandpipers and other types of shorebirds there at Bombay Hook. But our quest will really be for the red knot, a bird which is, at least the eastern subspecies, is declining seriously and is very dependent on refueling on horseshoe crab eggs. There's a lesson that is being taught called Green Eggs and Sand about the red knot and the horseshoe crab relationship. And we will talk about that in the last class. Get some other shorebird features as well. So we did get knots last year. We'll see if we can do it again this year. They weren't at Bombay Hook, but they were just down the coast from there. Find them at Muskillian Light. So hopefully by the time those birds arrive, there'll be some information about them. Anybody have any particular questions? I do encourage, we've got a total of 20 in the class. Seldom more than 3/4 ever comes on any given field trip. But I do encourage, if you've got friends in the class, to carpool if you can. Sometimes we'll meet together and carpool from that location, but very often on some of these other trips, we'll meet somewhere else and hopefully a safe place where we can leave cars if necessary. But again, if you can travel with friends, that would be great. And I deliberately sent out that last email this morning with the email addresses on it. So you can get those addresses. If you did not get that email and go home and find out you still didn't get it, email me and let me know. So, because that's going to be the major way we'll, as a group, we'll confer and share information. I don't mind phone calls.
So I got the email reminding me, Chesapeake Forum, I got that email this morning, but I didn't get back.
Okay, that one was
So
sent,
those are separate.
that one was sent about 11 o'clock, so maybe you didn't get a chance.
I didn't.
So if you didn't get it when you go home or whenever you check your email again, let me know.
Wayne, I'm just checking my email and I don't see it.
Okay,
Second email with the addresses.
okay. Let me know, Mary, and I'll make sure.
If this is something you'd like to go out to everybody, if you share it with me, I'll create a courses you a memo for it, just like people got this morning. That was all done like 2
Okay.
months in advance.
All
I
right,
can schedule to send out, and it'll have all that.
super, okay. So we'll try to, especially with the next field trip coming up, probably tomorrow, I'll send out a message, so see if we can make sure that everybody gets that. If you don't, I don't mind you calling me, it's important. The cell phone number works fine, and you can text me a short note if necessary as well. If I remember taking that airplane. Okay.
Are the times that you have the time that we need to be at the
That's a good question. In most cases, that's when we start the trip, so we'll actually start earlier in terms of getting together.
Okay.
I moved it up last semester. We started at 8 o'clock because basically that was almost first light. And bird activity really drops off after about 3 hours from dawn. So I moved it up to 7 a.m. So some of these trips you'll notice are 7 to 10. So we'll try to get out of there around 10 o'clock when we're on short day trips to be able to capitalize on the early bird song. This is rather different than last semester as well, because the birds are going to be singing. They're going to be active. It's not going to be you have to look at a chip or listen for a little peep or see motion in the bushes. Hopefully these birds will be singing, and in some cases on territory. So we want to be there when the action is best. Okay. Good questions, and hopefully we'll all be, by the end of tomorrow, we'll all be in contact. Okay. All right. As I say, this is some of the more mundane things, but about binoculars, if you're new to this course or new to birding, and that's what this course is all for, a little bit about our basic tool, which are binoculars. They come in two kinds, but almost all of them now are the roof prism design, which are look like a straight tube from eyepiece to ocular, but in fact there is a prism inside there to help to rectify the image or be backwards. And so roof prism is now the binocular. I would say it may be of choice, I'm not sure, but it's the one that you're most likely to find if you're on the market. If you have an older pair, or if in fact you do find poro prisms, they are just as good. There the prisms are aligned at angles so that the light comes in the ocular and goes out the eyepiece by turning the corner, whereas in the roof prism, it's basically more or less like a straight line. Sometimes roof prism binoculars used to be called compact binoculars. Be careful of that term, because some compact binoculars are meant to go look at an opera and not birds. Okay. In terms of what these numbers mean, the larger of the numbers, 42, is the diameter of the eyepiece in millimeters. And the 8 or 10 or 7 is the power of magnification. Birders, for the most part, and I strongly recommend this, will prefer 8 by 42. 7 by 42 is okay. It gives you a nice wide field of view. And it's great if your eyes are really good. 8 gives you a little bit better power and still a nice, fairly wide field of view. I have 10 by 42s that I'm using, and I regret the fact that I bought them years and years ago when my hands were steady and my eyes were better. But if you buy the 10 power, you think, oh, wow, that's great. I can get a much closer look at the bird. Yeah, but a much more restricted one. The bird flits off and you can't find it. And frustrates the heck out of me. So I would definitely recommend to be perfectly happy with 8 by 42 if you're buying a new pair. If you wear eyeglasses, as I do when I'm in the field, not these particular ones, but these binoculars right now are set up for non-eyeglasses. So there's a little distance between the eyepiece and my pupil. If you wear glasses, these either push or screw in, give you no distance, and then you can hold them right up to your glasses. So be sure that if you're going to buy a pair and make an investment in getting a decent pair, that they have that capability. For the most part, everything I'm talking about is pretty standard now if you buy binoculars that are outfitted for birding. Field of view, again, 350 feet or so at 1,000 yards. That number I don't pay a lot of attention to, but if it's something we're going to spend a lot of money on, have a look at that. They should be able to focus close to within about 15 feet, maybe a little less. Otherwise, you get a warbler in the bushes or a kinglet or something like that, and you can't focus on it, and it looks like a blur. So be sure that they have that capability. Binoculars, again, outfitted for birding usually are. If you've got $3,000, you can buy a nice pair of Swarovski, and they probably have garnet lenses. I don't know. I bought a pair of Celestrons for my daughter for Christmas. Got it on sale through Amazon, and it was $100. Probably, I would say, expect to spend $150 to $200 for a pair that will serve you well for some time. You can pay a bit more, probably get a slightly sharper image. It depends a little bit on your eye. In terms of the straps, most people now that I know go out birding don't like this kind of strap. They like the harness. It fits over the shoulders. It takes some of the weight off of your neck. But there are others who just prefer this, and it's simple, and almost all binoculars come with it. So you get a good start there. The harness costs you $20 to $30 extra if you order it. And then finally, something about the correct use. If I'm looking at Justin here, and he's singing away on his perch, I see where he is. I might even catch a little bit of the background, like there's this big limb across the top or something like that. Keep my eyes on him and bring the binoculars up this way. Don't look down at the binoculars. Keep your eye on it, and this takes some practice, but then put them on. And if you do, you'll see more birds and miss a lot fewer. Okay. I don't have a real brand name. There used to be a couple of companies that sold strictly birding type optics, but they've gone belly up to the larger firms. If you Google binoculars for bird watching and binoculars for birding, you probably come up with some. And I have gotten it from Amazon, and there's some other camera marks. If you really want to invest in something terribly expensive, I'd recommend going up to Cape May Bird Observatory in New Jersey, where they have a lot of binoculars and spotting scopes there, and you can look through them, get comfortable with what's up, because you're going to spend a bit more to get them. Okay, all right for that. Okay, guys. I am very hard to wrap up in a piece of paper and put between codes, so we rather use a variety of guides. When I first started teaching this course, we relied on Peterson's Field Guide for the Birds of Eastern North America. It's gone through a number of editions. Roger Tory Peterson is famous of starting the whole Field Guide series back in the 30s and actually opening up birding to the general public. I'll show you a general picture of it as well. I do recommend that you get a field guide that covers just this part of the U.S., that is east of the Great Plains, or they often say eastern region. If you get a field guide that covers all of North America, there's about 800 species. And a lot of the western warblers and other things are just going to confuse you. If you're starting, this is worth the $30 or whatever it is now to buy that. This one was 1995, several years old. The other, well, let's look at how Peterson lays it out. Peterson now in his current field guide series, the late Roger Tory Peterson, basically puts a series of similar looking birds on one page, and the facing page has a small thumbnail type map of the range of that bird, breeding, winter, their color coding, and a short description of the species itself and the key, what Peterson called the field marks. Those things that are very distinctive and help with the identification. They aren't necessarily unique to each species. You'll notice most of these warblers here have wing bars, but a non-wing barred warbler would not be included with that, and that would help narrow down the other possibilities it might be. You'll see arrows pointing to those field marks, and they're usually pointed out in the text as well. In the back of the book is a larger range map of all of the species. So if you really want to see is it around here or not, it's a little bit better. You see the states This is the standard one. There are a lot of other ones that are similar to this. Sibley, for example, and I don't know, 5 or 6 other authors. Some of them, like Peterson's, use paintings, try to give an overview of what the bird looks like. Some use photographs. The problem with photos can be that you often just see the best photo, and that's not the best bird you've seen. So there are Ken Kaufman and some of the others have photoshopped some photographs. And they do okay, but I think they raise expectations that you're going to see a bird that looks exactly like the picture, when in fact it doesn't. That's Peterson's. If you want to have a little bit more weight and keep your car on the road, use Crossley. This one fits neatly in the back pocket of an elephant. But it is a superb bird guide. Richard Crossley was at Cape May for a long time. He's now moved to the West Coast. He has an Eastern edition. He has a Western edition. He has one on waterfowl. He has one on birds of Britain. And they're all called the Crossley ID Guide in one form or another. What Crossley does is he does work with photographs, but in a rather interesting way. If you've ever tried to take pictures of birds, you realize that you throw out 20 photographs for maybe the one good one that shows up. He saves those 20 and shows the birds at different, if you will, levels of magnification from close to far. He also usually tries to put the birds against the typical habitat. That itself takes a lot of photoshopping because your eyes are able to capture that whole distant habitat and close habitat sort of together. Your brain works that out. But if you did that with a photograph, the background would be out of focus if it were distant and too much in focus. So actually, this particular picture of a yellow-throated warbler is a combination of about 10 warblers and 4 or 5 habitats photoshopped in and seamlessly put together. It's quite a tremendous effort, but it really works. And this will show you the bird up close as it might appear in the typical painting of Peterson, but also the way you're likely to see it, which is 40 feet away in a pine tree. He has much more terse descriptions, and his maps are kind of, I'd say, well, they're small, let's put it that way. But the photo is worth an awful lot. I always have this book in the car, and if we see a bird that we need to look at better, and I can't show it up on my tablet computer to you, we'll look at it. Peterson is perfectly adequate for beginning birds. So those are 2 approaches. You can buy Crossley's book. In fact, I think you can buy them both down at Blackwater, among other places. In the shop center. There is now online stuff. I don't use it as much as for bird identification. I do use it in my teaching. But there is an app called Merlin, which is put together and it's free. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology. You can download the app to either an iPhone or to an Android phone. And it will help you identify the bird. It walks you through what did you see, and in 5 steps, it kind of narrows down the possible species based on, did you see the bird by the water? Was it big? Was it little? Was it colored? There's another part of Merlin where you can literally hold your phone up and record the song, and Merlin will try to identify what species it is. I have found that to be marginally right. They're working on it. But eBird, which is the Cornell Lab of Ornithology citizen science site, eBird does not accept identifications done solely by one. The person has to at least have seen the bird or have it collaborated with others or even a picture, especially if the bird is uncommon. So it's useful if you're not familiar with birds and their names and so on. That's probably fine if you're used to that kind of technology. I do not rely on it much myself, but I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I actually, the eBird database that you'll see me using in the field to record the species we see links with Merlin's field identification part. And so if we think we had a yellow-throated warbler, I can put that in the checklist and link immediately in the field to the yellow-throated warbler description in Merlin and show you the picture. In fact, show you a series of pictures and even play the song. So it's a great teaching tool from my end. We'll be using it that way. There are other apps. that are available on the fund to do a variety of things. It's no use going through the plethora of them. This is a particularly good one to start with if that's what you're interested in. Thank you. Conceptually wise, this is something that you'll hear a lot about in the field when you're with me, and it has to do with the process of ecological succession. It's an orderly process whereby we'll take an old field example, an old field succession, whereas a field is left fallow and allowed to go through over a period of 10 to scores of years, a change in the habitats that it produces. So if we start with a bare field and the farmer passes away or otherwise abandons it and doesn't sell it to development, in a year or two, it's invaded by grasses, and in a year or two after that, shrubs begin to move. Red cedars, sweet gum, and perhaps other shrub trees, including some fruit trees like cherries and things like this, where the seeds were left in what's called the seed bank and they didn't die. In other words, when the farmer abandoned the seeds of the soil, there's seeds there already, and that's the seed bank, and they may sprout. So they also are early succession habitats. In time, however, pine trees invade because they are very well adapted to gathering a lot of sunlight. They're not very shade tolerant, and they're pretty good at growing quickly in soils that may not be that rich. But in time, the pine trees cannot succeed themselves because they're not shade tolerant. Underneath them grow some understory trees, oaks, beech maples with nice broad leaves that are harvesting, are kind of waiting for an opening to occur, if you will, in the forest canopy, and eventually the pines are replaced by an oak hickory forest, which in older books used to be called the climax community. Wouldn't change anymore, but now we know that's not true. Our oak hickory forest is evolving even now through a slower pace of succession, and we're replacing oaks and hickories with beeches and maples. You can set that succession back. That's essentially a couple of these slides. What happens? For example, when we look at a bare field, or in this case, a lawn, that's an early successional stage. Left to its own, it will be followed by some other form of habitat. But we mow it. Or if you're a farmer, we plant seeds and put crops there. That's an early successional stage too. All of those things, in a sense, set back succession to a previous stage, and left to themselves, they would then change again, but we keep setting them back. That's what agriculture really is like from an ecological perspective. So that's the soybean field. If we begin to look at the grass shrub stages, that same soybean field that I showed you was left fallow a couple of years ago. It happens to be near my front yard. And Queen Anne's lace and other types of grasses succeeded the crop, if you will, the soybean crop. And so we have a grassland type of stage, sometimes with mixtures of other types of grasses. There's a great mullein plant there, taken at Atkins Arboretum. Sometimes these grasses actually, if left to their own, will grow in clumps, which is useful for the birds because it gives them pathways to hide, like buckwheats and others. And eventually, in this part of the world, those grasses are invaded by cedars, or in this case, loblolly pine. And so we wind up with a pine forest in time. But in between, like this is at Pickering Creek, we have sometimes some fairly thick, young sweet gums, sometimes forming a very dense stand because there's a lot of sweet gum seeds in the seed banks in a lot of these old fields here on the eastern shore. Down at Horn Point, where I took this picture years and years ago, we had red cedar coming in before the others. I guess there was not enough gum in the seed bank. In time, here again at Pickering Creek, the gum trees get to be 10, 15 feet tall, and they're quite woody. So this is kind of a scrub following grassland. All right. Then we go on to the climax community. We're going to be talking a lot about grasslands, and we're going to be visiting several good examples of that. And there's a reason for this. In 2019, this paper came out in the journal Science, heavily peer-reviewed. Multiple authors, but a lot of these people are people the birding community knows real well. Peter Mara, who's now at Georgetown University, was with the Smithsonian. Michael Parr was head of the American Birding Association, and a number of others. It's usually cited as Rosenberg et al., 2019. What this article says, it's really data rich. Most of that you have to explore on your own, but this is just from the summary. Based on eBird records, citizen science records, national radar networks for weather, the Christmas bird count, the Audubon Christmas bird count has been going on since the turn of the last century, 1900. It was its first year. Let's see, CBC, the North American Breeding Bird Survey that Chandler Robbins started in 1966. All of those huge databases, they compiled them together over the past 50 years, actually 48 years, and indicated that size estimates indicate a net loss approaching 3 billion birds from North America in the past 50 years. This is not species, of course. 3 billion birds, populations defined by. That represents about a third of the North American species. So in the past 50 years, we've had that decline. They were able to proceed their analysis a little bit further and look at where some of these changes occurred. The only group that increased were the wetland birds, the waterfowl. And I've talked about this in the other course. I won't go into a lot of it here, but we underwent a major conservation effort to save the breeding grounds of a lot of our ducks in the prairie pothole region of the upper Midwest, the Dakotas, parts of Minnesota, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and Canada. That concerted effort actually reversed the decline of waterfowl. And all the ducks and geese that we see here in the Chesapeake region, they're winter residents. They go back to that kind of an area to breed. That was the only success, but it does kind of tell you that ecological conservation programs can work if they're done correctly and done forcefully. Everybody else declined. Those bars all going to the left are all representing declines. Eastern forest, we've lost about a quarter of our species, not our species, a quarter of the birds in terms of abundance. The biggest decline, however, was grassland species. Those species that breed in early successional habitats, that abandoned farm field that's maybe 5 or 6 to 10 years old. Those species have declined a lot. Now, some of that is not local here because it deals with prairie-type species that includes sage grouse, various pipits, and longspurs, and so on. But it does include species that are here as well, including the northern bobwhite. That was the last time we saw one of those. And we were fortunate last semester to see meadowlarks, but that's been declining as well. And there are several other species that are part of this class of birds that are on the wane. And it's the overhaul. There is about 45% of the grassland species that have declined in the past 50 years. So I'm going to harp a lot about that early succession stage, and it's why we're going to go to Live Farm and look at a concerted landowner initiated effort to try to, if you will, at least address that change, perhaps locally help it out and see what we can do. But those are habitats that we used to think of as waste. You know, if it's just growing up weeds and grasses, what good is it? It ain't growing houses, it's not growing corn, and but in fact, now we're actually beginning to see some deliberate efforts to establish grassland habitats, Oxford Conservation Park, Frederick Douglass Park, among others, and then private lands like the Live Farm. We're beginning to see efforts to do something about that, to maintain those habitats. And it's not easy because you can't just set aside a park and say, this is going to be a grassland. You've got to manage it because succession is going to. So we have to set back succession to the stage in which you want and keep it that way. And that requires periodic mowing, sometimes annually, sometimes semi-annually. It requires not allowing the woody growth to take over and somehow dealing with that. Sometimes management involves pesticides, although that's more like an agricultural. But nonetheless, it's You can't just leave it alone. It's not like an old forest. It's going to change very, very slowly. These things change in the period of our lifetime and decades.
The last time I was in Blackwater, they had closed down part of a road because they were doing a big burn,
That's right.
right? And that's what they're doing.
And, you know, all things being equal, ecologically, controlled burn is the best. It's not always feasible for obvious reasons, but that's the best way to set back succession. Absolutely. And they're doing that up at, there's a campus of Washington College, the field in one campus or something like that. And we're going to go by there when we go up there next week, and they're going to try to do a controlled burn. That's what the Native Americans did. They managed this landscape before the colonists ever set foot, and they managed it with fire. And it's probably a total misconception that when John Smith got off the boat, he saw a trackless forest. This was a heavily managed landscape, even then. People have been on this landscape ever since they arrived. And they used fire and other tools to basically maintain it in the early successional stage because that was the productive stage. Lots of mass, lots of fruit, lots of seed for the birds and the other type of wildlife. It really was responsible for the legendary abundance of game here in this region. And here on the eastern shore, actually from Carolina all the way to Long Island, this was all open savanna, maintained by the Native Americans. So they knew about it before we even wrote the text. Okay, the other real theme about this is bird migration. These are compiled data, not from bird banding studies, but from folks like us who contributed to the website eBird, which now has approximately 1.5 billion checklists of individual sighting worldwide. It's the largest database on natural populations in the world, and we did it. Our class actually has been contributing to eBird ever since I started teaching. So here we see it kind of color-coded. The darker the color, the more abundant the bird is, or the more sightings there are that have been submitted to eBird checklists. There you see it wintering in the Yucatan, crossing the Gulf of Mexico, spreading up to the eastern United States, and then later in the fall coming back to its wintering grounds. This is the wood thrush. They aren't quite arrived here yet, but they're pretty close. And you can see on the slider over on the right side, you can see the month of the year at which these data are being presented. We're going to come back to this again, and I'm going to try to see if I can stop this in a couple of stages to show you and interpret a little bit more for you. But this is the phenomenon, migration. Why do birds do it? Some don't. In fact, a lot of them do. We don't really know how it evolved. It used to be thought that bird migration like this was a response to the receding glaciers. And the last one around here was about 10,000 years ago. That's a fairly short evolutionary time. But we were glaciated over the past 2.5 million years in a series of 4 major glaciations. Evidence now suggests that migration is older than that it's something that developed in birds at least, and maybe other animals as well, prior even to the ice ages, although the ice ages, the species that survived the ice ages maybe were taking advantage of it. We were pre-adapted to them. We think that some of it has to do with the fact that in the tropics, there's more nest predation, so that species that stay there and try to reproduce there are really at risk of being preyed upon. The nestlings don't survive very well. And those birds that left the tropics and moved into temperate areas had less predation, therefore could raise more young, and therefore in time we get this change in bird behavior that slowly evolves. It's kind of interesting, though, the more we know about birds, the more fascinating it is. Birds like the wood thrush, and people know about the yellow-rumped warbler and others, they switch from insect diets when they're breeding them to fruit and berries and things like that on their wintering. And they start it even as they move out of this area in the fall. So like the hermit thrush that we see in the wintertime around here, it's eating holly berries, among other things. This switch, yellow rump warbler used to be called the myrtle warbler. Myrtle is basically a coastal plant that wax myrtle, right? And they're able to eat wax myrtle berries. They have a special enzyme in their gut. I actually think it's an intestinal bug that digests the wax on the outside of the berry and enables them to eat it. But they eat insects when they're on the breeding grounds up in the northern peninsula forests. So there is this change in diet as well, and it may be that the berry-eating, fruit-eating types of birds, bulbul oriole, eating that orange, okay, those things are more fundamental to where the birds were wintering, and that they switched in insect diets, in fact, is an advantage to them when they're moving up into the northern climates. In addition to which, northern climates have longer days in the summer. And so these longer days allow for more productivity, more insects, and birds are taking advantage of that productivity. And then when the season begins to fail in September or later, they leave, switch to berries, and head south where the crop is a little bit more reliable. So it's a complicated thing, and we're still learning an awful lot about bird migration. Well, probably you're most familiar with how we follow migration, and you're familiar with bird banding. You're going to go on Monday to see a banding station. The bands that are metal wrap around the bird's legs. They're very light, aluminum usually, and they have information about who to contact, the band number, and so on, so that you can report, should you find such a bird, live or dead, you can report it to a place where they have a clearinghouse for those records. And bands come in all kinds of sizes, all the way down to minuscule for ruby-throated hummingbirds, the things that go around the legs of barn owls and bald eagles. Banding in action, by the way, if you're British, it's called ringing there. Banding in action on a Maryland yellowthroat, there's a small little band being affixed to his leg. That is a heat, and in this case, it's on the left leg. And if the bird were found as a roadkill, or occasionally, the larger band, at least some people can see it through a spotting scope of binoculars, you get the number. And there's nowadays with the internet, it's easy to report it from. Cute little guy. These bands have not been shown to be a problem with the bird in terms of any types of inability to feed or fly correctly. The problem with bird banding, quite frankly, is that it's not very successful. In general, birds that are banded at Foreman's Branch and elsewhere, and there are hundreds to thousands of birds banded in a season, spring and fall, that less than 1% of them ever are returned in terms of information. It's a big crapshoot to be able to do this sort of thing. Well, enter a few years ago with plastics, color banding. Color-coded bandings, you would put 2 or 3 bands on a given leg. These, again, are very lightweight plastic. And the order in the color from the foot to the tarsus, up the tarsus, plus you can still put an aluminum band on for in case the bird is found elsewhere. But that has enabled one to identify the bird to a specific bird. If you color band, a lot of breeding birds studies that are now done at places like up at Washington College, they're able to follow the same bird all summer in the breeding season because all they have to do is look at the bands on the leg. They don't have to recapture the bird. They don't have to stress it out any further. And that enables them to begin to establish what kind of territories these birds have. So it's added a lot to our breeding behavior knowledge in terms of how the birds space out over a given type of habitat. But even better than that, in a sense, is the fact that color-banded birds, when they leave in the fall, they're in the same risk that any other banded bird is. They may never be found in wintering grounds. We know very little about wintering ranges. It's very sketchy for bird banding recovery. Color-banded birds, however, if the colors don't fall off, they come back, and we're finding out that these birds not only go away for the wintertime, wherever they go, it could be in South America, it could be in the southern parts of the United States, they get back and they say, God, that's the bird we banded last year, this site here. We're beginning to get a hint of site fidelity in terms of breeding. And a lot of these small songbirds, we have no idea where they go, or until color banding came in, whether the same ones came back or not. They've been doing this up at Foreman's Branch in a project up there, and they're getting up to 45% returns when the birds come back. Consider what the crapshoot is if you don't do it. Pretty amazing. Here's an example of a project that's been done up there. This was carrying on when I started at Washington College in 2000, actually started the year before. Douglas Gill, who is then is now retired, a faculty member at the University of Maryland, was studying, basically asking the question about what was it like in Maryland's old grasslands back when the Native Americans were, in fact, burning the landscape and managing these types of things. And so through a variety of efforts, he established basically a grassland plantation on about 100 some acres of old cropland, and basically was trying to study a particular species, the grasshopper sparrow, which is shown there in the upper right. The first year, the crops were basically herbicided, the whole thing was done and tilled up and then planted in a variety of native grasses. In the first year, still in 1999, they banded 92 grasshopper sparrows. They were kind of amazed. They don't even know where the bird came from. But suddenly, almost 100 birds descended on this area and started to set up shop in an area that had been nothing but a not very productive corn and soybean field before. The next year, new birds, they banded 270, 3 times as many. And the next year, in 2001, they banded 328. So Doug used to just tell me, he said, build a habitat and they will come. We don't know where from, but they come. And of course, they were studying with color bands, so they were studying their territories as well. It's quite an exhaustive research project. They were studying their territories as well, and they were also looking at the birds' return from their wintering habitat. And they found that returns from the previous year, color-coded bands, were 35 to 45%, as opposed to way less than 1% returns from the wintering themselves. Pretty amazing. In the fourth year, in 2002, the number of grasshopper sparrows banded dropped from 328 to 143 and continued to drop thereafter. What was going on? The grasslands were changing. And as a result of the changes in species composition and the fact that some grasses like switchgrass were taking over and forming very uniform, non-clumping types of habitat, the birds were being forced to breed in the marginal areas, which were usually the fire breaks at the edges. And so, as we say, it's not a matter of just setting aside the habitat. That's important. Making that decision is critical. But it's also a matter of managing it and knowing how to manage it. And that takes a little bit of work. Banding studies have also been pretty interesting. Meet wisdom. If you get anything out of this course, it'll maybe a little wisdom. Wisdom is a Laysan albatross that nests on Laysan Island. The old naval barracks there from World War II are still shown in the background. Wisdom was banded by the late Chandler Robbins, who was probably Maryland's most famous birder. He authored the Golden Field Guide of Birds, for such classics, if you will. She was banded in 1956 by Chan. Since albatrosses, at least this species, is not known not to breed until age 5, that was at least her age. She may have been a little older, but she was at least 5 years old in 1956. They did censuses at Midway, not every year, but year after year, if you will. And there was an aluminum leg band on the bird at the time, and so they were able to re-identify and show that wisdom was coming back to this same, literally within 100 feet of the same area, year after year. Sometimes she'd skip a year. Albatrosses do that, but still regularly returns. I think she went through about 5 husbands. All right. At age 82, that's Chandler Robbins. He returned to Laysan and met the bird and checked the band out again. At that point, if you do the math, the bird would have been 46 years old. Okay? In 2006, another U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologist came out here, asked Chandler Robbins where this bird would have been found. Chan said, oh, it's by this door, this window in the old barracks. She was within 100 feet of that spot. He found the bird, and he gave her a red-colored band this time. The other one was beginning to wear off. It's called Z333, and he is the one who named the bird Wisdom. In 2017, let's leave that. Okay. In 2021, on the 1st of February, Wisdom successfully hatched another chick. Already she was the world's oldest bird, but it was 65 years since she had been banded in 56. That makes her something like about 70 years old. As of last year, I have not been able to find out if she did return. She did show up late in 2021 in November, which is usually when she shows up. She did not nest that year, probably skipped a year, and we don't know if she's come back again this year. And if so, she'd be around, probably around now. So pretty amazing, all done with banding studies, and by far now the world's oldest bird, and apparently still going strong. Okay. There's your chick. Now let's go back to this. Now this will be cute, because I'm going to try to stop this animation. Get a pointer show up. Yeah, it doesn't want to do it. So I'll try to talk you through it as best I can. Let's start with the wintering grounds first. In the Yucatan, they crossed the Gulf of Mexico. Now, and notice, if you will, right at the edge of the Gulf in Louisiana, there's a white space. The bird, it's very famous. This is a hot spot for people who want to go out and see lots of birds dripping from the trees, because they cross en masse to the Gulf. But they only stay there a few hours. Then they fly inland where there's more food. So they basically sort of rest up without necessarily getting all the food they need. And then they move inland and spread out through the Ohio Valley and across the Appalachians to Oregon. You see the fading that occurs in the late summer. Now we're in December, but that fading that occurs, that's because the birds aren't singing anymore and people can't see them. The reason they're really intense here in the spring is that the birds are on territory singing away, and it's easy to say, oh, there's 5 wood thrushes there. I just heard a wood thrush over here, or whatever. And they set it off the eBird and the checklist. But in the fall, when the birds are not singing, they're much more hard to find, and therefore the number of observations goes down. It doesn't necessarily mean that the birds are not there. In fact, there's probably more birds there then because the young are still there. But that's the nature of the beast. Wood thrush is interesting also in that apparently it does not fly out of the Atlantic Ocean, at least in numbers. It doesnn't stage much at Cape May in New Jersey and wait for the next cold front to go and then fly out over the Atlantic and wind up in the Caribbean. It apparently uses the Gulf of Mexico and crosses it, both in the spring and in wintertime. It's estimated that during spring migration, somewhere around 2 billion birds cross the Gulf of Mexico, not just wood thrushes. 2 billion birds cross the Gulf on the way north. It's estimated that about 4 billion cross that area on the way south. Why the difference? Mortality in the wintertime. Okay. All right. Well, banding has its limits, as I pointed out to you. So what can we do to improve that sort of thing, and how can we get more information about what goes on in terms of bird behavior? There are a number of them. Basically, it's a method of using radio transmitters, which were initially too large to put on anything smaller than a bald eagle. But as miniaturization progressed, it's been possible now to put transmitters on and get information from birds at least the size of sparrows, and they're probably getting smaller, with thrushes, so. And it also enables one to band nestlings right after they fledge or right around the time they fledge, not band, but actually radio tag them. and then to see what they do. You see, in the banding studies that were done with just bird bands or rings, the birds themselves, once they left the area, they were not recaptured. We don't know where they went. If we're lucky, we find out they showed up somewhere in South America and somebody found them. But we don't know where they went from the time they were fledged until the time maybe a bird or two was caught somewhere else. So a huge gulf of information about that. What do they do? Where do they go? What kind of habitats do they? Radio transmitters are beginning to enable us to find that out. We can't obviously do it at the level of numbers that they do for the banding stations, but these are expensive, and it's a network of receivers as well. You can't just put the transmitters on the birds and then pick it up on your cell phone. So basically, a variety of ingenious techniques have been developed to be able to follow what these birds do, and probably the most prescient of these is called MODIS, which is not an acronym. It's actually from the Greek word for motion, and it does not mean anything else. So they call it MODIS. It's run out of Birds Canada with a lot of cooperation from the United States and certain of the countries in Europe as well. It's an international collaborative, if you will. And this is the size of transmitters that some MODIS studies are using. That's a penny there. And you can see just how short they are, how small they are, and they have a little antenna that sticks around the back. On the whole, it does not influence the bird's behavior as far as we know, or at least not significantly so. Here's one attached to an oven bird between the wings. They're not sewn in, they're strapped in, and eventually, yes, they do fall out. But in between, while they're still going, at least in some cases, the MODIS network can pick them up. And what's going on now is that in a large number of areas, and this includes the state of Maryland and the mountaintops, we're putting out MODIS receivers that receive the signals from these birds as they pass by. One of the members of our DNR was out there last summertime. Spent a single summer in the Allegheny Mountains, putting up MODIS towers. There is a small one, I think, at Washington College, when they see that at the banding station.
How is that attached to the bird?
It's attached around the wings fairly tightly enough,
Loops?
so it's loops. Yeah, they're loops. That's right. It's not fastened to the bird per se, but it's like putting on a shirt. And it sticks out the back, and the antenna follows along the tail. And believe me, they do fall. This was taken a year ago when I was teaching this course, so I haven't updated it. But at this point in time, about a year ago, there were 1,300 MODIS receiver stations. You can see the yellow dots all over the map there in 31 countries on 4 continents. And undoubtedly has been increased. Most of them are for birds, but they're also looking at bats and even dragonflies. Some of these transmitters are light enough that they're able to actually follow dragonflies and large butterflies.
What do they use for their power source?
It's basically a battery that eventually dies. Absolutely. High capacity battery. There are some that have solar charging, but that adds to the weight.
Well, my son developed a chip. He's an electrical engineer at Cornell that is for honeybees. He developed a chip that they glued to the back of honeybees to trace their course outside the hive.
Yep.
And he had to have a little solar panel or whatever, and also a transmitter so they could track
it.
bees.
And those are some of the problems, is being able to follow and keep them on. But the miniaturization is proceeding as you.
Yeah, the bee has a little backpack. Like
But eventually, they also have something that takes a little less energy called data loggers. There you have to recover the actual transmitter. And then it logs every so often, several times a day.
Because the bees would come back, and then unfortunately they had the other bees would attack the bee because they had a foreign, and so when he would get download whatever they go on.
That's right. They would download that. And that's been used as well. The MODIS network is now growing, but there are still other techniques that are used. In the last class, we'll look at some of the results of that study pretty fascinating. This is one that as I said, I don't want to go online and look at it because it's fairly difficult to get to it. And you have to get the right keys to do that. So, but this shows some modus tracks for a wood thrush. I believe it's a wood thrush. And the birds were all tagged up in Ontario, small town in Ontario. And this is what they were able to find in terms of where the birds went over the following season. It's very red up in Ontario, and then there are some further ones that manage to survive and get all the way down to the Yucatan, where we know the thrush winters based on eBird studies and citizen science. Some never made it across the Gulf, but they got that far. A few got to Florida. None of them were shown going out over the Atlantic, but there are no receivers out there, so it's hard to really tell. It's kind of an absence of data. But that real red area there, we'll look at that in detail at the end of the class and the course. And what it shows, because these birds are tagged as nestlings just about the time they fledge. What it's showing is that those birds are sticking around where they were tagged. Maybe that's no surprise. But they're going from the woods, the woodlands where wood thrush prefers to breed, to the edge and scrub habitat nearby. So we all talk about the breeding areas for the forest interior dwelling species, the PHIDs. Wood thrush being a great example, red-eyed vireo. Other birds are hopefully going to see this semester. We talk about preserving those habitats where the grassland and edge habitats are probably equally important. Why do the birds go there? Because they're more productive. There's more insects, there's fruit, some of them are beginning to switch diets. There's a lot of other available resources to them in those areas. And the modus tags show, when we actually look in some detail, all kinds of movement right around where the birds have been tagged themselves, but not in the same habitat. And then occasionally you get one that takes off like that thing up there in Canada. But nevertheless, by and large, that's what's going on. So we're beginning to understand that these edge habitats, these early successional habitats, are not only important for those species that breed them, like the grasshoppers, but also for those species that may breed nearby and then use those habitats in preparation for the migration. So there's a double whammy of importance in terms of those particular habitats. And that's one reason why, at least from my understanding, and I'm going to spend a fair amount of time trying to explain to you the nature of those habitats, how we maintain them, and look at examples of what John Shaw and what's going on at Douglas Park and other things about how these habitats relate to our bird conservation. So that's kind of the overall view of that, and we'll look at real details in the final class. And I have more time to explore that and maybe get some recent information. All right, let's go back to that previous slide for a minute. Again, with the wood thrush, you see it's going to the Yucatan, and we showed some earlier pictures showing how abundant they were, kind of localized in the Yucatan. Just in that particular area, a lot of the North American wood thrush population looks like it shows up there. That wintering habitat is important. Think about shorebirds, which take the red knot, have to stop at a given habitat like the shore of Delaware Bay to tank up on their way another couple of thousand miles to the Arctic to breed. Their dependence on that habitat, on the green eggs and sand that the horseshoe crabs create, has become really important to them. It's a stopover place. Where the birds spend the wintertime is another kind of stopover. It's just as important as the habitats we're trying to maintain here in North America. And so what we're trying to do now is the world, I'm afraid, is getting smaller, but I'm really worried about, what's going on in Ukraine and everything else. It's putting a real stopper on the kind of collaboration we need. But in fact, there's a project that the Smithsonian runs, and there are a number of other studies, and they call it the connectivity project. Connectivity. And it's basically linking a species and connecting it to where it's spending time, either as a migrant where it has to stop and, if you will, refuel in order to move on, as many shorebirds do, some of whom breed in the Arctic, winter literally almost in the Antarctic. Red knots do. They go all the way to Tierra del Fuego. Huge types of things, but also those birds that in fact want to spend time on the coastal forests of South America or on the islands in the Caribbean in specific habitats. And the more we know, we're beginning to find out that the quality of that wintering habitat relates to the ability of birds to be reproductively successful in its breeding habitat. So take, for example, American redstarts. In fact, actually, I'll come back to that. Yeah. Journal of Peter Mara, article Peter Mara did in Science, looking at American redstarts and showing that where they spent the winter in Hispaniola, the islands in the Caribbean, if they were forced to live in scrubby type and not very productive habitats there, they arrived later on the breeding grounds when they migrated back north, and they had less weight gain, therefore were reproductively less successful than birds that were in a richer habitat on the island. They used, of all things, carbon isotopes to identify the different populations. So the connectivity, which those migration therefore connects different parts of the world with one species at a time. And being able then to collaborate with parks and with other places in Latin America or the Caribbean or wherever here from the North American perspective, being able to find colleagues down there and citizens and groups interested in bird conservation connects with our birds up here in this kind of a project that is called connectivity. It requires, however, a really uniform, collaborative world. And I'm just concerned, I'm sure we all are, about the ramifications of this for conservation of birds, but other animals and organisms as well. So that project is just getting off the ground. There is a website out of the Smithsonian called the Connectivity Project, and they were supposed to be able to show you real-time, or at least within the year, MODIS-type data following specific species of birds as they connected during their migration. That was 2 years ago, and it's yet to come to pass. So I don't know whether they still have the necessary funding to do this, or whether the collaborations are on hold, what's going on. But you can see where we're trying to go with this sort of thing, to try to build partnerships with like-minded people in other countries, perhaps in different cultures, with the ultimate goal of connecting our bird species one to another. Here's another bird I hope we will see, the rose-breasted grosbeak. When they arrive, they sometimes show up at feeders before they head off and start feeding on buds and other things on the ground. But here again, their studies indicate they were banded as fledglings, or at least as young birds, set with transmitters up north in a variety of places, and they're connecting to locations in Central and South America. And these are not necessarily the exceptions. This is apparently the rule for a lot of our migrant birds. Where they spend the winter, how they spend the winter, how successful they are spending that winter has a tremendous influence on how successful they are when they get back up here. So that loss of somewhere around a third of the North American bird population may not just be all us. It may not be all our fault, if you will, but it has to do with the fact that habitats that are key for migrant birds are also key in other parts of the world and affect our populations here. It's not a very rosy outlook, but on the other hand, if you're a glass half full ecologist or something of that sort, there's hope, because we know a lot more about what it is we need to do. The real question is generating the will to do it, and to do it in collaboration. So that's good enough. As an introduction to the course, now we're going to go into the field on Monday and begin to see the birds. The whole idea is to try to see everything we see as well as we can, and to get everybody to have a look at it, and we'll do our identifications that way. The familiar species, that's great. If you've been in the course, I rely on your eyeballs. My eyes and ears are not as good as they used to be, but there's enough seasoned folks in here now who can help us out, and we're going to try our very best to learn maybe 100 or so species per course. And if nothing else, right, Peg, you'll get familiar with the names, so you'll know kind of what it is and what it isn't. And you'll also learn new nomenclature like dihedral. Thank you all so much. I think that's it. We have a few minutes. If you have any questions, yes, Peg.
Well, would you, give the class, maybe some precautions if we go into the field, like what you should wear?
Excellent. In fact, I had a note here and I just overlooked it. Yeah, this is tick season. And if you don't like ticks, you can have sugars too. Yeah, they're out. My wife has been horseback riding a couple of times and found a few. So they're here. And a number of our field trips do go to grassy areas. Live Farm is a good example. Where we're going to go to Foreman's Branch, we'll be walking through some grass. So whatever you prefer to use as an insect repellent, by all means do so. I usually wear long pants. I will wear hiking boots. Some people tuck their cuffs into the boots themselves. That works too. But I do recommend spraying, not your skin, but spraying around the junction and up the leg a little bit with a deep type insecticide if you're allergic to that. I'm not insecticide, but repellent. If you're allergic to that, then whatever you want to use is your choice. By the time we get to Bombay Hook, we may have a few biting flies. We'll see what that's like. That's a little bit different, uncomfortable. But the main one right now is your knee down to protect yourself. I'll bring a little bit along with me in case anybody forgets. But that's really important. A tick is one thing, and I don't want Lyme's disease any more than you do. What you really don't want is a bunch of chickens. So that's a good point. Now, try to remind folks about that when I send that email. Okay, do check your emails and make sure that you got the one that I sent out late morning. Normally, I'll run them at least a couple of days ahead of time. Hopefully, I'll get caught up with some of the other stuff I got to do. But welcome. Great to see everybody. Wonderful class. And, we sure had a lot of fun last fall, so I think we did.
I just have a question, just logistically, where are we going and how are you going to send something out?
Yes, I will send information out. I'm not sure yet. I'm waiting to hear back from the person who'll be running the banding station. She may be out of town, but normally I would think we would arrive there at 8 o'clock. I'm thinking of meeting at the Royal Farms on Route 213, just before Chester. It's fairly direct to get to it. And there's also a potty stop there. So if we met there like at 7:30, that would put us to the banding station easily. And we can carry it. There's plenty of parking there, and you'll be out of your car once we get there. So you're not too worried about numbers of vehicles there on the footprint. Yes, I will send directions to there and time. So, and if anybody, for some reason, needs a ride, I may be. Anything else? Okay, well, have a great weekend. Let's get a little cooler, okay? Whoa.